BBC is a British public service broadcaster. The broadcaster was founded on October 18, 1922 as British Broadcasting Company and on January 1, 1927 as British Broadcasting Corporation, and was founded by the HM government, and to this very day the broadcaster is still alive and healthy. So, how did it become so popular? Let's find out. The birth of British broadcasting from 1920 to 1922. Britain's first live public broadcast was made from the factory of Macaroni Company in Chelmsford in June 1920. It was sponsored by the Daily Mail's Alfred Harmsworth, 1st Viscount Northcliffe, and featured the famous Australian soprano Dame Nellie Melba. The Melba broadcast caught the people's imagination and marked a turning point in the British public's attitude to radio. However, this public enthusiasm was not shared in official circles where such broadcasts were held to interfere with important military and civil communications. By late 1920, the pressure from these quarters and uneasiness among the staff of the licensing authority, the General Post Office, GPO for short, was sufficient to lead a ban on further Chelmsford broadcasts. But by 1922, the GPO had received nearly 100 broadcast license requests and moved to re-sign its ban in the wake of a petition by 63 wireless societies with over 30,000 members. Anxious to avoid the same chaotic expansion experienced in the United States, the GPO proposed that it would issue a single broadcasting license to a company jointly owned by a consortium of leading wireless receiver manufacturers to be known as the British Broadcasting Company, Ltd., which was formed on October 18, 1922. John Reith, a Scottish Calvinist, was appointed its general manager in December 1922, a few weeks after the company made its first official broadcast. L. Stanton Jeffries was its first director of music. The company was to be financed by a royalty on the sale of BBC wireless receiving sets from approved domestic manufacturers. To this day, the BBC aims to follow the Reithian Directive to inform, educate, and entertain. From private company towards public service corporation from 1923 to 1926. The financial arrangement soon proved inadequate. Set sales were disappointing as amateurs made their own receivers and listeners bought rival unlicensed sets. By mid-1923, discussions between the GPO and the BBC had become deadlocked, and the Postmaster General commissioned a review of broadcasting by the Skies Committee. The committee recommended a short-term reorganization of license fees with improved enforcement in order to address the BBC's immediate financial distress, and an increased share of the license revenue split between it and the GPO. This was to be followed by a simple 10 fee to fund broadcasts. The BBC's broadcasting monopoly was made explicit for the duration of its current broadcast license, as was the prohibition on advertising. To avoid competition with newspaper, Fleet Street persuaded the government to ban news bulletins before 7 p.m., and the BBC was required to source all news from external wire services. Mid-1925 found the future of broadcasting under further consideration, this time by the Crawford Committee. By now, the BBC, under Reith's leadership, had forged a consensus favoring a continuation of the unified monopoly broadcasting service, but more money was still required to finance rapid expansion. Wireless manufacturers were anxious to exit the loss-making consortium, and Reith was keen that the BBC be seen as a public service rather than a commercial enterprise. The recommendations of the Crawford Committee were published in March the following year and were still under consideration by the GPO and when the 1926 United Kingdom general strike broke out in May. The strike temporarily interrupted newspaper production, and with restrictions on news bulletins waived, the BBC suddenly became the primary source of news for the duration of the crisis. The crisis placed the BBC in a delicate position. On the one hand, Reith was acutely aware that the government might exercise its right to commandeer the BBC at any time as a mouthpiece of the government if the BBC were to step out of line. But on the other, he was anxious to maintain public trust by appearing to be acting independently. The government was divided on how to handle the BBC, but ended up trusting Reith, whose opposition to the strike mirrored the PM's own. Although Winston Churchill in particular wanted to commander the BBC to use it to the best possible advantage, Reith wrote that Stanley Baldwin's government wanted to be able to say that they did not commander the BBC, but they know that they can trust us not to be really impartial. Thus, the BBC was granted sufficient leeway to pursue the government's objectives largely in a manner of its own choosing. The resulting coverage of both striker and government viewpoints impressed millions of listeners who were unaware that the PM had broadcast to the nation of Reith's home, using one of Reith's sound bites inserted at the last moment, or that the BBC had banned broadcasts from the Labour Party and delayed a peace appeal by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Supporters of the strike nicknamed the BBC the BFC for Falsehood Company, for British Falsehood Company. Reith personally announced the end of the strike, which he marked by reciting from Blake's Jerusalem, signifying that England had been saved. While the BBC tends to characterize its coverage of the general strike by emphasizing the positive impression created by its balanced coverage of the views of government and strikers, Seaton has characterized the episode as the invention of the modern propaganda in its British form. Reith argued that trust gained by authentic impartial news could be used. Impartial news was not necessarily an end in itself. The BBC did well out of the crisis, which cemented a national audience for its broadcasting, and it was followed by the government's acceptance of the recommendation made by the Crawford Committee from 1925 to 1926 that the British Broadcasting Company be replaced by a non-commercial Crown character organization, the British Broadcasting Corporation. 1927 to 1939. The British Broadcasting Corporation came into existence on January 1st, 1927, and Reith, newly knighted, was appointed its first Director General. To represent its purpose and stated values, the new corporation adopted the coat of arms, including the motto, "Nation shall speak peace unto nation." British radio audiences had little choice apart from the upscale programming of the BBC. Reith, an intensely moralistic executive, was in full charge. His goal was to broadcast all that is best in every department of human knowledge, endeavor, and achievement. The preservation of a high moral tone is obviously of paramount importance. Reith succeeded in building a high wall against an American-style free-for-all in radio in which the goal was to attract the largest audiences and thereby secure the greatest advertising revenue. There was no paid advertising on the BBC. All the revenue came from a tax on receiving sets. Highbrow audiences, however, greatly enjoyed it. At a time when American, Australian, and Canadian stations were drawing huge audiences cheering for their local teams with the broadcast of baseball, rugby, and hockey, the BBC emphasized service for a national rather than a regional audience. Boat races were well covered along with tennis and horse racing, but the BBC was reluctant to spend its severely limited airtime on long football or cricket games, regardless of their popularity. John Reith and the BBC, with support from the Crown, determined the universal needs of the people of Britain and broadcast content according to these perceived standards. Reith effectively censored anything that he felt would be harmful, directly or indirectly. While recounting his time with the BBC in 1935, Raymond Postgate claims that BBC broadcasters were made to submit a draft of their potential broadcast for approval. It was expected that they tailor their content to accommodate the modest church-going elderly or a member of the clergy. Until 1928, entertainers broadcasting on the BBC, both singers and talkers, were expected to avoid biblical quotations, clerical impersonations, and references to drink or prohibition in the United States, vulgar and doubtful manner, and political allusions. The BBC excluded popular foreign music and musicians from its broadcasts, while promoting British alternatives. On March 5, 1928, Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, maintained the censorship of editorial opinions on public policy, but allowed the BBC to address matters of religious, political, or industrial controversy. The resulting political talk series, designed to inform England on political issues, were criticized by members of the Parliament, including Winston Churchill, David Lloyd George, and Sir Austen Chamberlain. Those who opposed these chats claimed that they silenced the opinions of those in Parliament who are not nominated by party leaders or party whips, thus stifling independent, non-official views. In October 1932, the policemen of Metropolitan Police Federation marched in a protest at a purposed pay cut. Fearing the dissent within the police force and public support for the movement, the BBC censored its coverage of the events, only broadcasting official statements from the government. Throughout the 1930s, political broadcasts had been closely monitored by the BBC. In 1935, the BBC censored the broadcast of Oswald Mosley and Harry Pollitt. Mosley was a leader of the British Union of Fascists, and Pollitt a leader of the Communist Party of Great Britain. They had been contracted to provide a series of 5 broadcasts on their party's politics. The BBC, in conjunction with the Foreign Office of Britain, first suspended this series and ultimately cancelled it without the notice of the public. Less radical politicians faced similar censorship. In 1938, Winston Churchill proposed a series of talks regarding British domestic and foreign politics and affairs, but was similarly censored. The censorship of political discourse by the BBC was a precursor of the total shutdown of the political debate that manifested over the BBC's wartime airwaves. The Foreign Office maintained that the public should not be aware of their role in the censorship. From 1935 to 1939, the BBC also attempted to unite the British Empire's radio waves, sending staff to Egypt, Palestine, Newfoundland, and Jamaica, India, Canada, and South Africa. Reith personally visited South Africa, lobbying for state-run radio programmees, which was accepted by South African Parliament in 1936. A similar programmee was adopted in Canada. Through collaboration with these state-run broadcasting centers, Reith left a legacy of cultural influence across the Empire of Great Britain with his departure from the corporation in 1938. Experimental television broadcasts were started in 1929, using an electrical-mechanical 30-line system developed by John Logie Bard. Limited regular broadcasts using this system began in 1932, and an expanded service, now named the BBC Television Service, started from Alexandra Palace in November 1936, alternating between an improved Bard mechanical 240-line system and the all-electronic 405-line Macaroni EMI system, which had been developed by an EMI research team led by Sir Isaac Schoenberg. The superiority of the electronic system saw the mechanical system dropped early the following year, with the Macaroni EMI system the first fully electronic television system in the world to be used in regular broadcasting. BBC versus other media. The success of broadcasting provoked animosities between the BBC and well-established media such as theaters, concert halls, and the radio recording industry. By 1929, the BBC complained that the agents of many comedians refused to sign contracts for broadcasting because they feared it harmed the artist by making his material sale, and that it reduces the value of the artist as a visible music hall performer. On the other hand, the BBC was keenly interested in a cooperation with the recording companies who in recent years have not been slow to make records of singers, orchestras, dance, bands, etc., who have already proved their power to achieve popularity by wireless. Radio plays were so popular that the BBC had received 6,000 manuscripts by 1929, most of them written for stage and of little value for broadcasting. Day in and day out, manuscripts come in and nearly all go out, again, through the post, with the note saying, "We regret," etc. In the 1930s, music broadcasts also enjoyed great popularity. For example, the friendly and wide-ranging BBC theatre organ broadcast at St. George's Hall, London by Reginald Fort, who held the official role of the BBC staff theatre organist from 1936 to 1938. Second World War. Television broadcasting was suspended from September 1st, 1939 to June 7th, 1946, during World War II, and it was left to BBC radio broadcasters, such as Reginald Fort, to keep the nation's spirits up. The BBC moved most of its radio operations out of London, initially to Bristol, and then to Bedford. Concerts were broadcast from the Bedford Corn Exchange. The Trinity Chapel in St. Paul's Church, Bedford, was the studio for the daily service from 1941 to 1945, and in the darkest days of the war in 1941, the Archbishops of Canterbury and York came to St. Paul's to broadcast to the UK and the world on National Day of Prayer. BBC employees during the war included George Orwell, who spent 2 years with the broadcaster. During his role as Prime Minister during the war, Winston Churchill delivered 33 major wartime speeches by radio, all of which were carried by the BBC within the UK. On June 18, 1940, French General Charles de Gaulle, in exile in London as the leader of the Free French, made a speech broadcast by the BBC, urging the French people to not capitulate to the In October 1940, Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret made their first radio broadcast for the BBC's Children's Hour, addressing other children who had been evacuated from cities. In 1938, John Reith and the government of the United Kingdom, specifically the Ministry of Information, which had been set up for World War II, designed a censorship apparatus for the inevitability of the war. Due to the BBC's advancements in the shortwave radio technology, the corporation could broadcast across the world during the Second World War. Within Europe, the BBC European Service would gather intelligence and information regarding the current events of the war in English. Regional BBC workers, based on the regional geopolitical climate, would then further censor the material their broadcasts would cover. Nothing was to be added outside the preordained news items. For example, the BBC Polish service was heavily censored due to the fears of jeopardizing relations with the Soviet Union. Controversial topics like the contested Polish and Soviet border, the deportation of Polish citizens, the arrests of Polish Home Army members, and the Katyn massacre were not included in Polish broadcasts. American radio broadcasts were broadcast across Europe on BBC channels. This material also passed through the BBC censorship office, which surveilled the edited American coverage of British affairs. By 1940, across all BBC broadcasts, music by composers from enemy nations was censored. In total, 99 German, 38 Austrian, and 38 Italian composers were censored. The BBC argued that, like the Italian or German languages, listeners would be irritated by the inclusion of enemy composers. Any potential broadcasters said to have a pacifist, communist, or fascist ideologist were not allowed on the BBC's airwaves. In 1937, a MI5 security officer was given a permanent office within the organization. This officer would examine the files of potential political subversives and mark the files of those deemed a security risk to the organization, blacklisting them. This was often done on spurious grounds. Even so, the practice would continue and expand during the years of the Cold War. Later 20th century, there was a widely reported urban myth that upon resumption, the BBC television service after the war, announcer Leslie Mitchell started by saying, "As I was saying before, we were so rudely interrupted." In fact, the first person to appear when the transmission resumed was Jasmine Bligh, and the words said were, "Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Do you remember me, Jasmine Bligh?" The European Broadcasting Union was formed on February 12, 1950 in Turkey, with the BBC among the 23 founding broadcasting organizations. Competition to the BBC was introduced in 1955 with the commercial and independently operated television network of Independent Television, ITV for short. However, the BBC monopoly on radio services would persist until October 8, 1973, when under control of the newly renamed Independent Broadcasting Authority, IBA for short, the UK's first independent local radio station, LBC, came on air in the London area. As a result of the Pilkington Committee report of 1962, in which the BBC was praised for the quality and range of its output, and ITV was heavily criticized for not providing enough quality programming, the decision was taken to award the BBC a second television channel, BBC Two, in 1964, renaming the existing service BBC One. BBC Two used the higher resolution 625-line standard, which had been standardized across Europe. BBC Two was broadcast in color from July 1st, 1967, and was joined by the BBC One and ITV on November 15th, 1969. The 405-line VHF transmissions of BBC One and ITV were continued for compatibility with older television receivers until 1985. Starting in 1964, a series of pirate radio stations, starting with Radio Caroline, came on the air and forced the British government finally to regulate radio services to permit nationally based advertising finance services. In response, the BBC reorganized and renamed their radio channels. On September 30th, 1967, the light programming was split into Radio 1, offering continuous popular music, and Radio 2, more easy listening. The third programming became Radio 3, offering classical music and cultural programming. The home service became Radio 4, offering news and non-musical content such as quiz shows, readings, dramas, and plays. As well as the 4 national channels, a series of local BBC radio stations were established in 1967, including Radio London. In 1969, the BBC Enterprises Department was formed to exploit BBC brands and programmees for commercial spin-off products. In 1979, it became a wholly owned limited company, BBC Enterprises Limited. In 1974, the BBC's teletext service, CFAX, was introduced, created initially to provide subtitling, but developed into a news and information service. In 1978, BBC staff went on strike just before the Christmas, thus blocking out the transmission of both channels and amalgamating all 4 radio stations into one. Since the deregulation of the UK television and radio market in the 1980s, the BBC has faced increased competition from the commercial sector and the advertiser-funded public service broadcaster Channel 4, especially on satellite television, cable television, and digital television services. In the late 1980s, the BBC began a process of divestment by spinning off and selling parts of its organization. In 1988, it sold off the Hulton Press Library, a photographic archive which had been acquired from the Picture Post magazine by the BBC in 1957. The archive was sold to Brian Dutchland and is now owned by Getty Images. In 1987, the BBC decided to centralize its operations by the management team, with the radio and television divisions joining forces together for the first time. The activities of the news and currents department and coordinated jointly under the new directorate. During the 1990s, this process continued with separation of certain operational arms of the corporation into autonomous but wholly owned subsidiaries, with the aim of generating additional revenue for programming making. BBC Enterprises was reorganized and relaunched in 1995 as BBC Worldwide Limited. In 1998, BBC Studios Outside Broadcast, post-production, design, costumes, and wigs were spun off into BBC Resource Limited. The BBC Research and Development has played a major part in the development of broadcasting and recording techniques. The BBC was also responsible for the development of the NICAM stereo standard. In recent decades, a number of additional channels and radio stations have been launched. Radio 5 was launched in 1990 as a sports and educational station, but was replaced in 1994 with BBC Radio 5 Live to become a live radio station, following the success of the Radio 4 service to cover the 1991 Gulf War. The new station would be a news and sports station. In 1997, BBC News 24, a rolling news channel, launched on digital television services, and the following year, BBC Choice was launched as the third general entertainment channel from the BBC. The BBC also purchased the Parliamentary Channel, which was renamed BBC Parliament. In 1999, BBC Knowledge launched as a multimedia channel with services available on the newly launched BBC Text digital teletext service, later rebranded as BBC Red Button, and on BBC Online. The channel had an educational aim, which was modified later on its life to offer documentaries. 2000 to 2011. In 2002, several television and radio channels were reorganized. BBC Knowledge was replaced by BBC 4 and became BBC's Arts and Documentaries channel. CBBC, which had been a programming strand as Children's BBC since 1985, was split into CBBC and CBeebies for younger children, with both new services getting a digital channel, the CBBC channel and the CBeebies channel. In addition to the television channels, new digital radio stations were curated: 1 Extra, 6 Music, and Radio 4 Extra. BBC 1 Extra was a sister station to Radio 1 and specialized in modern black music. BBC 6 Music specialized in alternative music genres, and BBC 7 specialized in archive, speech, and children's programming. The following few years resulted in repositioning some channels to conform to a larger brand. In 2003, BBC Choice was replaced by BBC 3, with programming for younger adults and shocking real-life documentaries. BBC News 24 became the BBC News Channel in 2008. And BBC Radio 7 became BBC Radio 4 Extra in 2011, with new programmees to supplement those broadcasts on Radio 4. In 2008, another channel was launched, BBC Alba, a Scottish Gaelic service. During this decade, the corporation began to sell off a number of its operational divisions to private owners. BBC Broadcast was spun off as a separate company in 2002, and in 2005 it was sold to Australian-based Mercury Capital Alliance Group and Mercury Group Limited and rebranded Red Bee Media. The BBC's IT, telephony, and broadcast technology were brought together as BBC Technology Limited in 2001, and the division was later sold to the German company Siemens IT Solutions and Services, SIS for short. SIS was subsequently acquired from Siemens by the French company Atos. Further divestments included BBC Books, sold to Random House in 2006. BBC Outside Broadcasts Limited, sold in 2008 to Satellite Information Services. Costumes and Wigs, stock sold in 2008 to Angels Costumes. and BBC magazines sold to a media-to-media company in 2011. After the sales of OBS and costumes, the remainder of BBC resources was reorganized as BBC Studios and Post-Production, which continues today as a wholly owned subsidiary of the BBC. The 2004 Houghton Inquiry and the subsequent report raised questions about the BBC's journalistic standards and its impartiality. This led to resignations of senior management members at the time, including the then director Greg Dyke. In January 2007, the BBC released minutes of the board meeting, which led to Greg Dyke's resignation. Unlike the other departments of the BBC World Service was funded by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office, more commonly known as the Foreign Office or the FCO, is the British government department responsible for promoting the interests of the United Kingdom abroad. A strike in 2005 by more than 11,000 BBC workers over a proposal to cut 4,000 jobs and to privatize parts of the BBC disrupted much of the BBC's regular programming. In 2006, BBC HD launched as an experimental service and became official in December 2007. The channel broadcasts HD simulcasts of programmes on BBC One, BBC Two, BBC Three, and BBC Four, as well as repeats of some older programmes in HD. In 2010, an HD simulcast of BBC One launched, BBC One HD. The channel uses HD versions of BBC One schedule and uses upscaled versions of programmes not currently produced in HD. The BBC HD channel closed in March 2013 and was replaced by BBC Two HD in the same month. On October 18, 2007, BBC Director General Mark Thompson announced a controversial plan to make major cuts and reduce the size of the BBC as an organization. The plans included a reduction in posts of 2,500, including 1,800 redundancies, consolidating news operations, reducing programming output by 10%, and selling off the flagship television centre building in London. These plans were furiously opposed by unions, who threatened a series of strikes. However, the BBC stated that the cuts were essential to move the organisation forward and concentrate on increasing the quality of programming. On October 20th, 2010, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, announced that the television license fee would be frozen at its current level until the end of the current charter in 2016. The same announcement revealed that the BBC would take on full costs of running the BBC World Service and the BBC Monitoring Service of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and partially finance the Welsh broadcaster. 2011 to present. Further cuts were announced on October 6, 2011, so the BBC could reach a total reduction in their budget of 20% following the license fee freeze in October 2010, which included cutting staff by 2,000 and sending a further 1,000 to the Media City UK development in Salford, with BBC Three moving online only in 2016, the sharing of more programmes between stations and channels, sharing of radio news bulletins, more repeats in schedules, including the whole BBC Two, daytime for some original programming to be reduced. BBC HD was closed on March 26, 2013 and was replaced with an HD simulcast of BBC Two. However, flagship programmes, other channels, and full funding for CBBC and CBeebies would be retained. Numerous BBC facilities have been sold off, including New Broadcasting House on Wilmslow Road in Manchester. Many major departments have been relocated to Broadcasting House in central London and Media City UK in Salford, particularly since the closure of BBC Television Centre in March 2013. On February 16, 2016, the BBC Three television service was discontinued and replaced by a digital outlet under the same name, targeting its young adult audience with web series and other content. Under the new Royal Charter instituted in 2017, the corporation must publish an annual report to Ofcom outlining its plans and public service obligations for the next year. In its 2017-18 report released July 2017, the BBC announced plans to reinvent its output to better compete against commercial streaming services such as Netflix. These plans included increasing the diversity of its content on television and radio, a major increase in investments towards digital children's content, and plans to make larger investments in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland to rise to the challenge of better reflecting and representing a changing UK. Since 2017, the BBC has also funded the local democracy reporting service, with up to 165 journalists employed by independent news organizations to report on local democracy issues on a pooled bias. In 2016, the BBC Director General Tony Hall announced a savings target of £800 million per year by 2021, which is about 23% of annual license fee revenue. Having to take on the £700 million cost for free TV licenses for the over 75 pensioners and rapid inflation in drama and sport coverage costs was given as the reason. Duplication of management and content spending would be reduced, and there would be a review of BBC News. In September 2019, the BBC launched the Trusted News Initiative to work with news and social media companies to combat disinformation about national elections. In 2020, the BBC announced a BBC News savings target of £80 million per year by 2022, involving about 520 staff reductions. The BBC's Director of News and Current Affairs, Fran Unsworth, said there would be further moves toward digital broadcasting, in part to attract back a youth audience and more pooling of reporters to stop separate teams covering the same news. In 2020, the BBC reported a £119 million deficit because of delays to cost reduction plans, and the forthcoming ending of the remaining £253 million funding towards pensioners' license fees would increase financial pressures. In January 2021, it was reported that former banker Richard Sharp would succeed David Clementy as chairman when he stepped down in February. In March 2023, the BBC was at the center of a political row with football pundit Gary Lineker after he criticized the British government's asylum policy on social media. Lineker was suspended from his position on Match of the Day before being reinstated after receiving overwhelming support from his colleagues. The scandal was made worse due to the connections between BBC's chairman, Richard Sharp, and the Conservative Party. In April 2023, Richard Sharp resigned as chairman after a report found he did not disclose potential perceived conflicts of interest in his role in the facilitation of a loan to Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Dame Elaine Claw-Stephens was appointed as acting chairwoman on June 27, 2023, and she would lead BBC board for a year or until a new permanent chairman has been appointed. Samir Shah was subsequently appointed with effect from March 4th, 2024. And there's the history of BBC. How did it become so popular? Well, with them being around since the radio ages, I say that's how they became very popular, and they were able to expand their brand internationally as well, which gave them even more popularity. But anyways, this is where I'm going to end off this video. If you guys happen to enjoy this video, please make sure to hit the like button, and also don't forget to subscribe to get videos every single day, and also don't forget to check out my other two channels as well, Exotic Dan Walkthroughs and Dan's Place. And if you guys would like to see the uncensored version of this, where this video will have the swearing in it, you guys can head over to Dan's Place, where you can watch the version of this same exact video as well. And until then, I will see you guys in the next one. Goodbye!